Hi, this is Tamsen Granger.
This is Dan Abuhoff.
Well, Tamsen and Dan read the paper on Sunday, April 14th,
Right.
2019. We've been watching golf.
Golf, of course. Of course, because it's the Masters. The Masters. A tournament like no other.
The run for the azaleas.
The run for the azaleas. Well, you've been watching it. You're quite the golf fan.
Yeah, well, it just seems it's been actually quite exciting.
Yeah, it often is. It often is. But neither of us, we should disclose, neither of us are golfers. But the fact of the matter is you get kind of sucked in watching these guys.
Well, and just this year because
there's a lot of,
it was exciting.
There's a lot of drama. Anyway, this year is the story of Tiger Woods. And everyone, by the time this is released, will have read many, many articles, at least had the opportunity to read many, many articles about Tiger Woods, a comeback for the ages. Tiger Woods, for those of you who have been, I don't know.
Snoozing.
Yeah. Somewhere, but not tuning into the local media for the last 20, 25 years, was the greatest golfer of his time, was arguably the number one sports figure in the United States, if not the world, in going into the early 2000s, an icon. And then he disappeared from the scene for reasons we'll come back to in a moment. But the fact of the matter is...
tremendous fall from grace.
Yeah, well,
in addition to
let me set the stage.
Physical difference.
Yeah, we'll come back to that. The real point is there's a huge gap here. So what you have is, the major tournaments are the four majors: the Masters, the U.S. Open, the PGA, and the British Open. Those are the ones that really count for the guys who are the big time golfers. And he is second to Jack Nicklaus now in terms of majors. He's won 16 over his career. He won a number of them at a very young age. However, he won today. He won the Masters, but he had not won a major for 11 years. 11 years. And he had not won a Masters since 2005. 14 years. And you have this huge gap. And what is that huge gap about? And that's what you were referring to. If you were watching...
I mean, he was truly a phenom. So much so that my father... instructed us to tell our kids forget about this water polo nonsense.
Right.
Have your kids play golf,
and he didn't,
so that they can be multi-billionaires like Tiger.
And he didn't play golf either. So, So
no, my father had no interest in golf, but he was interested in success.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So
truly, Tiger was a huge success.
Well, if you watched this telecast, you would have heard quite a bit about this being the most amazing comeback of all time. And you would have heard his absence from the scene attributable to physical ailments, particularly back problems, and secondarily knee problems. So you would have understood it to be a tremendous, basically, overcoming of physical ailments and disabilities.
Physical rehabilitation.
Exactly, and laudable without any reservation. And of course, that's not the real story, right?
Well, it's not the complete story.
Not the complete story.
He had all kinds of things going on. Marital difficulties, a scandal that happened around Thanksgiving. I remember that was so long ago. Your family was here,
right,
in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, he was. Scandal's the word. He was a pariah. He was a pariah. People wouldn't mention his name. And golf, the popularity of golf suffered as a result. The number one guy was a pariah, and people lost interest. And we're not telling...
People were already losing interest in
you
golf.
Think so?
Don't
were
you
they?
Think? Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Younger
really?
people... golf has been diminishing.
But Tiger brought it back up. And then when the fall from grace, as you described, people like your dad weren't telling their grandchildren to play golf anymore. Whatever it was, and we're not going to go into great detail here, but it's just what's stunning is the complete absence, the complete vanishing of any recollection of what really happened. And everyone's sitting there talking about this in this telecast for an hour and a half about, what a back problem he had. You're going, what?
Yeah, but he did have a back problem.
He did have a back problem.
There's no question about that. But he had other problems. And he really had lost his mojo. He was... even having difficulties with various substances.
Right.
Like, was he taking
that's
for
right.
his back?
You remind me. He was pulled over at one point.
Yeah.
They didn't know if he was drunk or on drugs or whatever. He went to the bottom That wasn't part of the story.
Yeah. His reputation had completely gone off the rails.
I have nothing against Tiger Woods. I'm happy he won. But it will be interesting to see how this plays out.
Well, it was just interesting the way, the media and the PGA is spinning it. And you can't really blame them. But it's also interesting that, people were there cheering, going crazy.
Unreserved enthusiasm.
So his
and 10 years
image
ago,
lives on.
10 years ago, people were turning their backs on him. And I mean golf fans. Is
that really true?
It is true. It is true. It is true. It wasn't just a matter of he wasn't winning. It wasn't just a matter that he was hurt or was in a scandal. People were disgusted, and they felt they had been misled. They felt he was a fraud, and they had been. I'm telling you, there were strong negative feelings. Look, maybe this teaches us what the rehabilitation period is for a Me Too type situation. I don't know, but I think we're going to read a lot about it in the next few weeks. That's all I'm guessing.
Okay, well, that'll be interesting. Yeah. But anyway, so we were sucked in. We were watching it.
We were sucked in, and it was exciting. But that's not the big sports story. The big sports story, for those of us who follow these things, and no one's more on top of this than one Sadie Abuhoff.
Well, that's true. I talked to Sadie this weekend. I said, so have you been watching the Masters?
And she straightened you out.
No, I'm watching the hockey.
Hockey playoffs. This is hockey playoffs time, people. Hockey playoffs. There is nothing more intense than hockey playoffs, and there is no story that's more compelling than the story of the Tampa Bay Lightning. That's right. Apologies to Sadie on the Toronto Maple Leafs. Apologies to New York on the New York Islanders. They're both interesting and doing well. But the Tampa Bay Lightning is the story, and they're the story for two reasons. One is an article that you showed me, Tamsen, about how that franchise became a resurgent franchise. Now, think of the challenge there. They start a franchise that plays ice hockey some more than 20 years ago in Tampa Bay, which is, it doesn't freeze over too often in Tampa Bay.
So there wasn't that much interest.
No, there wasn't any interest.
Although Phil Esposito was among those who thought this is a good place to do it.
Phil, much more revered as a hockey player than a businessman. I will tell you that. You remember his brother?
Also a hockey enthusiast.
You remember his brother Tony was a goalie. Do you remember that too? The Esposito clan.
Right.
Totally hockey.
What I remember is Jesus saves, but Esposito pokes it in on the rebound.
Esposito scores on the rebound.
Yeah.
That was a bumper sticker. Yes, Phil Esposito was behind Tampa Bay, and they had some early success. They started in the early 90s, but by the time you got to the early 2000s, the success had petered out. And you know something? There are several southern teams in the NHL. And that would be, there's a team in Carolina, there's a team in Arizona, there's another team called the Florida Panthers. They don't do well. None of them do well. The only Southern team that does well, the Tampa Bay Lightning. There are several sports teams in Tampa Bay, in different sports besides hockey, baseball, football. They don't do well. The only team that does well, again, the Tampa Bay Lightning. Why? You pointed out to me it's because of their owner. It's a fellow named Jeff Vinik, who is one of those hedge fund billionaires, which we all like to talk about, who was in Boston and decided, number one, he wanted to buy a hockey team. Number two, that the team he wanted to buy was Tampa Bay, in part because he was determined to move
to wherever his team was.
Exactly, and he was more eager to move to Tampa Bay than to move to Secaucus or someplace near wherever the Devils were playing. So he moved to Tampa Bay, and he invested in the team, an enormous amount of money, $75 million, they say in the Wall Street Journal. Continues to invest in youth hockey and charitable causes around Tampa Bay.
That $75 million was in reference to the stadium.
That's right.
I'm not sure that was all his money, but I could easily see
he spent a lot of money.
He's invested more than that because Esposito, at a certain point, had raised $75 million to buy the team.
Right.
Even though he was begging to buy the team, even though he knew it was valued much higher than that. And the other fun thing that was in that article was that, in trying to figure out whether to even start a team there, they consulted a guy, Henry Paul.
Right.
And he said, well, will Tampa Bay go for a hockey team? He said, well, we love football. We love car crashes. We love boxing. We love wrestling. seems like with hockey, you got all that.
Exactly. It's all logic, but it doesn't necessarily work. So here's the problem now, though. Okay, so they had a great season. They're a successful franchise. They've had some, 50 sellouts in a row. The place is going crazy, and they win this season 12 more games than any other team in the entire league. And when you win the most games in the season during the regular season and get the most points, you win in the NHL something called the President's Cup. And you know who cares about winning the President's Cup?
Who?
Nobody. Because the President's Cup is the regular season. What people care about in the NHL is the playoffs. And the President's Cup victor is top seeded. But in order to be a successful season, you have to prevail in the playoffs. And that doesn't happen. In the last, what do we have? 32 years. The 32 years that they've awarded the President's Cup winner has won the Stanley Cup only 1/4 of the times, 1 out of every 4. So Tampa Bay is dealing with a situation where they're kind of expected to win. The fans hope that they win, and they go charging into the playoffs, and they lose their first playoff game to the Columbus Blue Jackets. Mm-hmm. And then they play their second playoff game, and they lose that game too. They're down 2-0. They could get knocked out in the first round of the playoffs. And that kind of thing happens in hockey, where a super team just gets off to a bad start and stumbles, and then it gets in their head, and they get knocked out by a team that barely got into the playoffs. I hope that doesn't happen at Tampa Bay. But that is the big story of the playoffs. And the NHL playoffs are the biggest thing going on right now. There's nothing as intense in sports as the NHL playoffs. More intense than Baseball World Series, more intense than the NBA playoffs. Because that's a very tough physical game. Those guys grind it out. They all grow playoff beards. They're unrecognizable by the end.
Well, did we give Jeff Vinik enough credit for everything he did to turn that team around in terms of local popularity? I mean, they went from 3,000 season ticket holders to over 15,000.
Yeah, well,
all right.
Listen.
They have sold out like 200 games.
200 games?
Row.
200 games?
And the only other teams that do that are like the typical,
top teams.
Detroit, Chicago,
the old line teams.
Yeah, Philadelphia, etc., Montreal. He's really made a tremendous investment in the community.
Well,
and
you know what
he's
really
involved the community. They give away equipment.
You know what it suggests is that you can do it. It suggests you can do it anywhere. It suggests that you can take any sport and in any city, and if you're willing to invest enough money in it, you can make it work.
A success.
But it's a lot of money.
Like Las Vegas.
Well, Las Vegas has been terribly successful, but that was they had success in the rink. I mean, what's tougher is to take a longer slog and to really say, we're not going to win. I mean, this is what the Islanders did years ago when I was growing up. Islanders were a franchise that was an expansion franchise. And last place in the shadow of the Rangers. And then they got it together and they won 4 Stanley Cups in a row. It's crazy. But they said, we're going to invest. You can do it. But it takes patience and it takes money. This guy's got both, I guess.
All right.
So we're going to turn to books. Books? Yes.
Time to talk about books?
Yes.
Well, let's talk about books. Let's talk about food books. How about that?
Sure.
Big article in I think,
Times.
what was it? The New York Times
book
about
section.
cookbooks.
Yeah.
But,
What?
none of them really, there were some nice pictures from them.
Well, I said...
If you're interested, go read the article. New York Times
pointed out to you, it's my subtle way of saying you might want to make this.
Nobody uses cookbooks anymore.
Did you take a look at the picture of the guava cake? The guava cake?
Guava cake?
Guava cake was right there.
All right, you go, be my guest. Go ahead, make a guava cake.
All right.
But here's the problem. It just seems so extravagant to buy a whole book and then make 1 or 2 recipes or never make any recipes. Just sit there and look at the pictures. Mm-hmm. So, I don't know. That aspect of writing may be doomed. But there was a review also in all the books, everywhere, tremendous amount of press for Ruth Reichl and her latest memoir, Save Me the Plums. and that is the story of the rise and demise of Gourmet magazine. And she was editor there for a while, and was out on a book tour promoting the latest gourmet magazine cookbook.
Yeah.
She was on the road when they let her know that the magazine was shutting down.
Well, hold on. So just bring me. Let me say that Ruth Reichl's the one that wrote "Tender to the Bone."
Yes.
So she was
Tender at the Bone.
Tender at the Bone. So
one
she
of
was
her
like
earliest memoirs about
the
food.
Restaurant reviewer for the New York Times.
She was originally out in L.A. Then she was at the New York Times.
So I read her. She's a very good writer. And
she is a very good writer.
But she left to go to the magazine. Is that it?
She left the Times to go to the magazine.
Right.
She knew nothing about magazines.
Right.
And let me just tell you this.
Go ahead. What?
I actually have been listening to the Audible version.
Yeah.
Of Save Me the Plums.
Oh, is that right?
Yes.
Oh, I didn't know that.
She is the narrator.
Ruth is?
Yes. And it's terrific.
Okay.
Okay? It is absolutely terrific. There is one chapter called Severine that is completely exquisite.
Yeah.
Okay? Had me in tears on the drive home on Route 95 from my work at Newtown, PA.
Okay.
So it,
she is a very good writer. I'll tell you that.
She is very good.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some chapters that are, less enchanting than others.
Yeah.
But it is especially delightful to listen to.
Because she's reading.
The writer of a memoir.
Yeah. Well, that means more if the writer is...
It's almost like a podcast. It's like a very good long podcast.
Right,
This person is in your car or, in your home talking to you and telling you these stories.
It's different than...
She's a wonderful storyteller. All her books, I think I've read almost all of them, have been quite enjoyable, including she wrote a novel, Delicious, that wasn't, to some extent, based on her experiences in
the magazine,
at Gourmet. Yeah. And that I listened to when I was on the road driving home that time from Atlanta.
Oh, really?
By myself, 12 hours.
When your husband
Ruth
couldn't fly out to get you.
We're there together in the car.
Yeah.
So I would definitely recommend "Save Me the Plums" by Ruth Reichl.
All right.
She has a tremendous enthusiasm for food. She's down to earth. Her big call to fame as the New York Times critic was she'd go in disguises. She would go to a fancy restaurant disguised as random middle-aged Midwestern tourist on a splurge and see how she got treated.
Oh, really?
And she had other disguises as well. And that would always be kind of fun and would resonate.
Okay. Well, the other book thing that jumped out at us had to do with all the articles about Robert Caro. And by that, I mean an article in the New York Times about his new book called Working, and not one, but two separate articles in two separate sections of the Wall Street Journal this weekend about Robert Caro, which led you to observe that he is the best public relations help there is, right?
Yeah, probably just edging out Ruth Reichl, who has been everywhere with her new book.
I don't know about edging.
I've seen her face all over the globe.
Yeah, but see, people read the Ruth Reichl stuff. I wonder who reads Robert Caro, though I actually know some people who do. So, look, here's the deal with Robert Caro, and I think most people know it. He is an extremely thorough, meticulous researcher. He writes extremely long books. They're on history, and as a matter of fact, they're only on two subjects. He only writes on two things. He's written on Robert Moses, and he's written on Lyndon Johnson, and that is it.
All right, so this is another Lyndon Johnson book? No.
No. This book is not. This book is
Did
working.
we talk about this already?
We did. We did because because a lot of his fans were ticked off that he wasn't working on the Johnson book, that he took this flyer to work on the working book. But it gives an opportunity. I mean, no one loves this book. People kind of like this book, but it's an easy to write about it because it talks about his method. And his method it's interesting. I mean, doesn't require deep thinking like reading about Lyndon Johnson. So what is his method? Why does it take him so long to write books? Well, it turns out it doesn't take him long to write. He writes very quickly.
It's the research.
It's the research.
Yeah.
It's the research.
Well, I saw the one Wall Street Journal article.
Yeah.
Because it's kind of cute. It tells about how he literally writes.
Yeah.
That he has a typewriter.
Yeah, yeah.
And people kept sending him the typewriters. He has a 2010 something or other.
The Smith Corona.
People send him their old ones. He says he gets two kind of letters.
Right.
One is, I've got this typewriter, maybe you could use it. And the two is, I've got this typewriter, would you like to buy it for $4,000?
Right, exactly. So, I mean, that is part of it. And I was going to talk about that. I'm glad you did. And his method actually doesn't make any sense.
But does it have to? It makes sense to him.
No, fine. It doesn't have to.
He
Absolutely.
also uses cotton typewriter ribbon.
Yeah, but let's start at the beginning. I mean, here's what he does, though. The first thing he does is he writes it out in longhand, and then he types it.
Yes.
Okay, this takes a long time. And then... types it on the Smith Corona, and
he says he does it very quickly.
Yeah, really quickly. And then he gets it in the galleys, and he writes notes on the galleys. So I don't know. He thinks he's doing this fast. Maybe he is, but it strikes me as a very long process. But in any event, it's the research, and the one thing that comes out in terms of his discussion of the research, he's totally meticulous. He turns over every page. He interviews at great length. But the one thing that does come across and carry over is. He says the trick to interviewing is to keep your mouth shut, basically, and give people a chance to talk. And a lot of interviewers never get that. He doesn't even get it. So he's sitting there taking notes, and when he looks at his own notes that he's taking, he sees every few lines the letters SU, SU, SU. What does SU mean? It means shut up. He's telling himself to shut up, and he's just listening.
But he also says he never uses a recorder.
Right.
He finds that people never get over the recorder. And he feels that creates a distance there or, a not real total level of comfort as if they're just talking to him. Yeah. I think that's interesting because especially during all these sports interviews we've been seeing the last few weeks, you will often remark that the interviewer completely sets up what answer they want in the question.
Because they guarantee that what's where they get the answer they decide is the right answer.
So they get
it moves it along
answer they want.
Because they're not willing to trust the intelligence or the insight of the person or even the English language speaking skills of the person they're talking to. So they give them the answer.
Right.
And they go, yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So he just sits there and lets the interviewee fill the void.
Well, the other thing, and they talk about his background and his career, and a couple of things come out of this. Number one, he did early on spend a fair bit of time at Newsday, which they describe as sort of a cerebral newspaper, which was news to me. It's the paper I grew up reading. It's in Long Island. It was a cerebral newspaper.
Come on, Long Island, the home of the top,
high school,
and
a cerebral newspaper. So I'm beginning to understand how it all.
Didn't understand.
Things
what you grew up with was
the best,
the epitome.
Exactly, the best. But also, as you can imagine, a guy only writes about two things and takes forever on a Smith Corona. He didn't have any money. So the article explains, and the book explains, I suppose, that he did sell his house at one point, and that when he finally sold part of, I guess it was the Moses book to the New York Times so they can put excerpts in, his wife said to him, "Great, now I can go to the dry cleaners again." So I believe it. I believe he didn't have any money. So anyway, he's a nice guy. He's very, what can I say? He makes the point that he and his wife go to sleep every night listening to Arthur Rubinstein's performance of Chopin, Pure Beauty. Arthur Rubinstein, you recall we were talking about John Rubinstein's father a few weeks ago, who you saw at Bucks County Playhouse. But in any event,
he's everything you would sort of imagine him to be.
Very professorial, very above it all, very intellectual.
Just very systematic. And, works for him.
Yeah, works for him.
Back to food, right?
Back to food. Well,
Are we allowed to talk about more food?
Yeah. Oh, that's right. Sure, go ahead.
More food.
Yeah.
Bunch of funny articles, or interesting, intriguing articles this week in the New York Times, as usual. More of those studies that it's hard to figure out if they mean anything, including one that said men who eat more than half a pound of red, white, or organ meat every day.
I'm listening. What happens to them?
A much higher percentage, risk of dying of heart disease than others.
Oh, I thought you were going to say they're more interesting.
Who eats a half a pound of meat every day?
Half a pound's a lot.
Half a pound's an extraordinary amount.
Every day is a lot.
We used to measure out a quarter of a pound for our sandwiches at the Cranberry food sampler, right. And it was a huge pile.
Yeah, these would be big
meat.
People. Yeah.
So, and also what they discussed is if the higher ratio of meat protein to plant protein.
Yeah, you're going to tell me that's negative too?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that's a huge surprise, but that's different from just talking about the actual amount, half a pound or not.
Yeah, but I mean, the more you're reading,
I mean, we should be aiming to enlarge our idea of what is.
But I mean, even the idea,
appropriate protein.
It's totally obvious from a certain sense, and I guess it's right. And they're saying it has profound implications. What you eat just means a lot in terms of the way you are. I mean, quite apart from what you're
before we get to that.
But before we get to that. What?
Okay. The other thing they had a headline about was omega-3s actually help your asthma.
I know. You're into omega-3. I've heard that before. This is the fish oil thing?
Fish will save the world.
Yes.
So it's really not...
When was the last time you saw a fish with asthma?
If you're a vegan, you have an issue.
Right.
Okay. But you got to eat more fish.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
But again, the fundamental point being, they're even talking about,
Well, there was a funny article.
Things like depression.
Now, this was legitimately kind of amusing.
Yeah.
The headline for this article was... the right food for a good mood. Yeah. And it starts out with the story of a doctor gets a call from a patient who says, hey, I just ate 36 oysters.
Yeah.
That's a lot of oysters.
It's a ton of oysters.
Okay. And he actually, he had gotten a recommendation from his psychiatrist to eat oysters. Yeah. And he said, I often tell people to eat oysters to improve their mood. They rarely do they go out and consume 3 dozen.
Something that's $100 worth of oysters. That's quite a load. Yeah, that's
that
impressive.
Is. That's true. Yeah. I want to meet this guy.
Yeah. He's probably.
But anyway. Interesting article, and I think we've heard about this before. Yeah. The idea that what you eat affects your mental well-being, right, and emotional well-being. That they are finding out that people who have deficiencies in omega-3 fatty acids are often found to have a higher incidence of depression and risk of suicide. And so, again, the idea that you might want to eat fish and other proteins that contain the omega-3s and vitamin B12, etc., will actually improve your microbiome, the healthy gut. And they feel, honestly, they're seeing research that says the healthy gut helps in processing neurotransmitters that regulate mood, like serotonin. Okay, so it's having an actual physiological effect on creating the good mood. Now, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, you're a little bit at risk or in trouble because plant-based proteins don't seem to have as much of that B12, etc., as the meat-based. But it is possible. You can take supplements, etc. So it just, and I think we've, for years we've been hearing, people eat too many comfort foods, the carbohydrates, etc. They end up depressed and so forth and so on. Sure. But again, healthy diet.
Yeah.
It's going to make you healthy in so many different ways.
It's the idea that they specifically link it to depression. is kind of interesting to me, because they're not doing this in a notional way. They're not just saying, well, gee, French fries, that always gives you some kind of a glycemic rush. They're just saying, if they're linking it to depression, it's pretty serious, it seems to me, or the absence of good nutrition. And generally you feel better when you eat better. So I believe all that.
Well, yeah. But they're finding out there's an actual physiological reason for that.
Yeah.
I think we're going to see more about this, because there was also an interesting article in The Economist by Peter Wilson about the death of the calorie.
Oh, really?
And it's really about the history of the calorie and how limited a concept it is.
You told me about this.
Yeah, and I'm not really prepared to talk about it in depth because it's a complicated subject. Yeah. But it was basically invented in the 19th century under rather primitive.
Yes. Well, what I took away from our conversation, I know you're not going to go into it now, but the idea that warm toast has more calories than cold toast has me thinking that we have to revisit this whole thing.
Yes, that your body can more efficiently process reheated
toast. I mentioned that because...
And reheated pasta. So what does this mean? Don't eat fresh food?
I was just going to say, I'm into warm toast, so I have to worry about that. But
warmed over toast. Yeah, reheated toast.
Anyway, let's talk about beer. Okay, something I understand.
Something that we all know is good for you.
Exactly right. And the Times reinforcing that with an article about two research scientists at the American Museum of Natural History.
I'm calling this segment Drunk Historians.
Oh, that's good.
Remember there's a show called Drunk History?
Yeah?
Yeah.
Do I know that?
That's the way our family is learning history lately.
Is that right?
Yeah, Drunk History.
Well, in any event, so it's Rob DeSalle and Ian Tattersall. And they work for the Museum of Natural History. And apparently every Friday night, they're both...
Is this in New York?
Yeah.
In New York.
On 75th Street.
At a real museum.
The Museum of Natural History, where they did those movies, So here's the deal. Instead of having the movies that
Come on, buddy, let's do a little museum drinking.
Right. Well, you remember Night at the Museum, those movies?
Yeah.
Well, this is Night at the Museum.
Drinking.
Yeah, no, because this is the real life.
Okay.
And these guys, instead of, seeing if Teddy Roosevelt's going to come to life, they actually go up into someone's office and they crack out some beers. And they've written a bunch of books together. They talk about what kind of research they're doing. They're anthropologists going forward. They talk about some of their ideas. But they also talk about beer and the scientific, underpinnings of beer, the relationships of different beers. Because they're scientists. They can't look at things any other way. They got to take them apart no matter what they have.
Did they ever see, Teddy Roosevelt?
They haven't mentioned that in the article. But they've written two books in 2015, A Natural History of Wine, and now they're coming out with A Natural History of Beer. They can't help themselves. They're going to take a scientific view of beer. And they sit there and they compare notes and they fill up notebooks about everything they think about beers, and they think about the hops in this particular beer and if it's related to some hops in another beer.
They think about it, or they do actual research? Are they just drinking or randomly
there's a picture
writing
here.
Down stuff?
They're drinking and writing. As you can see from the photograph, they're in action there. And they have created a field book logging observations of beer's character and taste. And they've done it for 200 different beers over the years. They try to sort out the relationships among beers, categorize them, treating them as organisms, or so they say. And DeSalle says, look, we're not claiming it's great science, but it's a cool thing to do. So they're
cool
doing
for them.
Cool for them.
Yeah.
But you brought my attention to an article about something called a mild ale. Mild ale.
Did you know anything about mild ale?
Yes. You'll be happy to know
about
your
mild
husband
ale?
Because I drink one of the principal ale they're talking about. I've had before.
So ale, I generally don't go for.
I don't know.
Ale is generally bitter.
Okay.
Isn't it?
I think that's a gross generalization. It can be, but here's the deal. Actually, these mild ales are not that harsh tasting. Hence, they're called mild. They're generally English. A lot of the English ales are called bitters, but they really are that bitter. As a matter of fact, one of the reasons they're mild is they're not as highly carbonated as some of the other beers. They're not as hopped up. They don't have a very strong flavor. They're supposed to be the kind of beers that you can drink all day, like a session beer. And
yeah, I did notice in the article they seem to have lower alcohol.
They're about 4.5%, which makes them lower.
Some of them are even lower.
Yeah,
the ones they list there.
So, so all this would be highly theoretical and of no interest if you couldn't get it in the United States. But in fact, there is a prominent brand that I've drunk in the United States called Yards Brewing Company Brawler. How's that name? Brawler. BRAWLER. 4.2% ABV. Described as clean and crisp. Less a chewy hunk of bread than a stack of snappy whole grain crackers. So there you go. I mean, that's the one to look for. I've had it. It's fine. It's good.
And that's a local company.
Yeah. Oh, Philadelphia. That's the Philly company.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we want to always support the local businesses.
That's right.
And that might be a fun thing to support.
Yeah.
Okay, moving right along here.
Yeah.
We made an interesting discovery last week. And we did tell our listeners that we were going to head to the small screen and watch...
Head to the small screen.
Yes, head and watch our favorite Killing Eve.
Killing Eve.
Weirdest spy show ever.
Right.
And it did not disappoint, but in our stupor, in our television-induced stupor after Killing Eve, we did not turn off the TV, and what appeared but Discovery of Witches.
Right.
Which I was reluctant to watch because that show is based on the book series, the trilogy I read by Deborah Harkness, which I really did enjoy because it combines a lot of my favorite things. You know, hunky, wealthy guy meets a historian in England. Rang a lot of bells for me. And so since I liked the books...
That rang a lot of bells?
Yes. Doesn't everybody dream of reading a guy with limitless wealth, who is also good looking, who is also cerebral?
I was thinking of Jeff Vinnick there. Go ahead. But yeah.
All right, I'll show you the pictures of Jeff Vinnick. Yeah. Nothing against Jeff.
Yes.
But he's no Matthew Good.
All right. Well, let's get to Matthew Good in a second. But you read it in the book. You were saying that you made a strong impression.
I liked the book, so I was worried about watching the show because you're mostly disappointed, aren't you?
You're often disappointed. You're often disappointed
at how your, a favorite book is visualized by somebody else.
But let's cut to the chase. You weren't disappointed.
No, it was good. I think it's good. Yeah. It might be good.
Yes.
And you liked it because the main character actually loves to row. When she has a tough
the young woman.
day,
that's right.
She runs down to the Thames. Is it the Thames? No, it's not the Thames.
Why not? It's probably the Thames.
I don't know.
I think it is the Thames.
England rivers, but she's at Oxford.
Yeah.
Does the Thames go to Oxford? Who knows?
Yeah.
But anyway, she runs down to the boathouse, hops in the scull,
Yeah.
and rows like crazy for hours, it seems. I'm not even sure if people can do that, but...
Yeah, well, anyway, I don't care about the rowing. But the fact of the matter is, it was pretty good, and you were skeptical at the beginning, and you were making remarks like, I don't know, this guy is not going to live up to the hero. He's not good looking enough. And as I said to you, that's Matthew Good.
Yeah.
Matthew Good is considered the best looking actor in television.
He's still not my favorite, but the show was I didn't have to turn it off, and you seemed rather charmed.
I liked it. Yeah, it's nothing to do with the rowing. And I don't normally go with the witches type stuff.
So, sucked in once again by the small screen.
It is a vampire show.
It's embarrassing.
Yeah, but sucked in. Well, we'll see. We'll watch it again tonight.
Speaking of
wait, hold on. We should say. So it's at 9 o'clock on BBC America.
We have listeners all over the globe.
Right? You. Yes.
They don't all have
right.
Dish TV.
Sorry. I apologize.
Plus, the modern generation, they can find this.
No, they can't.
Without
I don't think so.
Looking for
nothing about the modern generation shows me that they can find anything. I haven't seen that. But in any event, the other movie we keep saying we're going to see, and now you're going to have to see it, is SHAZAM. And here's why. It turns out that SHAZAM, the actual word SHAZAM is an acronym. Did you know that? SHAZAM is an acronym?
No.
Yes. SHAZAM is an acronym for the names of the 6 immortal elders who are the source of Billy's the kid, who becomes SHAZAM, his superpowers. It's the wisdom of Solomon, there's you get your S, the strength of Hercules, the stamina of Atlas, the power of Zeus, the courage of Achilles, and the speed of Mercury. How do you like that?
Yeah, Alice is not the greatest.
Not the point. Is that up your alley or what?
Well, yeah, except it's not really.
You're captivated. I
Yeah.
knew you would be. No, there's an interesting story just generally. People kind of like it. It's kind of a fun movie, but it did come out the same time as Superman, shortly thereafter. And the reason it got sidelined, it was very popular years and years ago in the 40s. The people who
As a comic book.
It was a movie. There was a movie in the 40s.
There's a movie in the 40s.
Yeah.
And it was well received?
Yes.
Okay.
And matter of fact, the first comic movie was Shazam. Because they beat Superman to the punch, but the Superman writers sued them for copyright infringement and won because it was too similar to Superman. And that's why it got sidelined for about 15 or 20 years.
So what happened?
It came back in a different way. They worked their way through it. And DC Comics eventually got it. It's all corporate nonsense. But the fact of the matter is, they came back and then they ran into another problem because Shazam's real name then was Captain Marvel. By that time, the name Captain Marvel had been sold to probably the Marvel Universe. I can't keep them all straight. But the fact of the matter is, now he's got to be called Shazam. But it was considered too derivative. But it's quite different from Superman. And it's got all these, Hercules, Atlas, all that kind of stuff. So it comes from a different place.
Atlas is he's a big lummox.
Really?
Yeah, not the smartest, not the sharpest tool in the shed.
He's only part of the acronym, okay? He's a very small part of the acronym.
He goes crazy and...
all right, I'm sorry I mentioned
Atlas.
Atlas.
Kills a bunch of sheep because he thinks they're,
So we will...
Greeks.
All right, well, that was clearly a misfire. And finally we'll close with an obituary, which is just kind of interesting, but it's another place, another time, and it might as well be the ancient Greeks because it seems so long ago. Richard Cole died. Yes.
A much more worthy...
Oh, no question about that. Richard Cole, the last survivor of the Doolittle Raid on Japan, dies at 103. So the Doolittle Raid. So Jimmy Doolittle was a very famous name in U.S. Air Force history, and at a certain point in time, the most famous name in U.S. Air Force history. And why? Because 6 months or something like that after Pearl Harbor, that's about right. In April 1942, he led a raid. It was a small raid, just a small group of airplanes, and about 80 different Air Force personnel. A raid on Japan, and which was kind of considered impossible. The Japanese were getting the best of it in those first few months of the war, and there was this thought that the Japanese defenses were impenetrable. Certainly, they had a superior air force, and this was sort of a low-key raid launched in secret, and they stayed low so they wouldn't attract attention in anti-aircraft barrage. And they got through. They got into Japan and they did some damage. And most of them got out, but not all of them. And the deal was that they were supposed to continue into China, which was friendly territory at that time. And some of them made it. Almost all of them crash landed because they're running out of fuel, but they ran into the crash in a way that they weren't hurt or hurt badly. But not everyone made it into China, and some were captured, and some were tortured, and some died in captivity, a small number. But it was considered a very successful raid, and actually, in many people's view, turned the war, at least at a certain point in time, early on, and changed the thinking. It led the Japanese to invade Midway, which was a mistake on the part of the Japanese, and so on. So it's a long story. There's a movie about it called 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, in which Spencer Tracy, no lesser person than Spencer Tracy, before the war was over, 1944, played Doolittle. And again, Cole was like the second in command. And what's interesting is that the group that was part of this mission would get together in reunions every year for many years. And they finally said, the group had winnowed down. They were so old they had to put an end to it. So the last get-together was in 2013. And at that get-together, they had a plane, a restored B-25 Mitchell bomber, which is the kind of plane they used, owned by a private owner, a fellow named Larry Kelly, and he flew the plane with Richard Cole. And Richard Cole actually took controls of the plane the entire time. Kelly said to the press afterwards, I told him to hold 1,500 feet on the altimeter, to keep that in terms of the altitude, and I kept looking at the altimeter and it was 1,500 feet the whole time. It wasn't 1499. It wasn't 1501. It was 1,500 feet. And apparently Cole landed the plane beautifully, and he got out, and he said, no big deal. It's the same way as it was then. All I did was prove how rusty I am. Cole was 97. So in any event, a good life, 103. But it's also a reminder of, that within people's lifetime, there were events like this that were of great significance for the country. And it's quite a story. So in any event, that sort of winds it up for us this week. All we can do is commend you to the National Hockey League playoffs. You got a lot of catching up to do.
Okay. So, on that note, this is Tamsen Granger.
And Dan Abuhoff.
Tamsen and Dan read the paper. We'll be back again in a week.
Thanks.